بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to lesson number 4 of the video series Arabic Grammar for Understanding the Quran. Now, hopefully you recall that the conjugation of Arabic verbs can be broken down into 3 major classes. Number 1, we can have conjugation for the past tense, al-fi'l al-madi. 2, we can have conjugation for the present tense, al-fi'l al-mudari'. And last but not least, we can have conjugation for the command form, fi'l al-amr. In the past 2 lessons, we talked about the different conjugation rules and patterns that allow us to change any verb, any fi'l, into the past tense, the madi. Now we're going to be moving on to the present tense, al-fi'l al-mudari'. The present tense can be broken down into 3 classes of case endings. We can have al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu', al-fi'l al-mudari' al-mansub, or al-fi'l al-mudari' al-majzum. In this lesson, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu', and then in the following lesson, we'll be discussing the mansub and the majzum forms. Here are the contents for today's lesson. Now, before we dive into conjugation of verbs in the present tense, I want to take a step back and share some strategies that you may find helpful. These are strategies for mastering conjugation, whether you're reviewing past tense conjugation or learning more complicated conjugation patterns in the future. Hopefully, you'll find these strategies to be beneficial. Afterwards, we'll talk about how to conjugate verbs in the present tense into the fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu' tense. And last but not least, we're going to be learning how to negate al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu'. So let us begin, inshallah. First off, strategies for mastering conjugation. As a student, these are some concerns that you may have at this point. I understand the conjugation rules, but for some reason they're not sticking in my head, or I need to think for a very long time whenever I see a verb to figure out how it's conjugated. So to help you address these concerns, I decided to offer some strategies. These are strategies that I used as a student to master conjugation, so hopefully you'll find them helpful as well. Basically, there are different ways for you to look at conjugation or creative drills to help you practice conjugation. In combination, all 3 strategies will inshallah help you develop a well-rounded familiarity with the various rules and patterns. What are these strategies? Number 1, visualizing the chart. 2, going forwards and backwards. And 3, what I would like to call the conjugation marathon. Strategy number 1, visualizing the chart. So hopefully by now you've become fairly comfortable and familiar with this verb conjugation chart. For the purpose of review, by column we have organization based on number. So on the far right we have your singular, personal, standalone pronouns and their respective conjugated verbs. In the middle column, we have the dual pronouns, which we have not yet learned. And then to the far left, we have the plural standalone personal pronouns and their respective conjugated verbs. Now by row, we have organization based on person, third person, second person, and first person, as well as organization based on gender, masculine and feminine. So what do I mean by visualizing the chart? Basically, what I would like you to do is train your mind to picture this whole thing in its entirety, except in a simplified form, just like this. Okay, so training yourself to picture this chart. Notice how I've taken away the various headings and subtitles, and I've also taken away the personal standalone pronouns. So what you're left with is a bird's eye view, a complete bird's eye view of everything that is essential. This is all that you need to know. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to use the verb without relying on the personal pronoun. So instead of saying antum fa'altum, notice that if you memorize the chart and you know the position of each verb, the position intuitively tells you that fa'altum is conjugated for the second person because it belongs on the second row. It is conjugated in the plural form because it is on the far left column, and that it is masculine because it is on top. all that information becomes intuitively and automatically tied to the position of the verb. So I strongly urge you to memorize the chart, to be able to visualize it in this way, using this simplified shorthand form. And also in the future, whenever I conjugate verbs, I will be using this version as well. Strategy number 2, going forwards and backwards. So here, what I would like you to do is to list out the pronouns in one column. Huwa, hum, hiya, hunna, anta, etc. And then to the left, list out the associated conjugated verbs. So you would have huwa fa'ala, hum fa'alu, hiya fa'alat, hunna fa'alna, etc. Going forwards is basically training yourself to go from the pronoun to the verb. So you would take a piece of paper and cover up the left column and then try to predict the verb. So then you would move this paper down as you proceed. Going backwards is simply covering up the pronoun and training yourself to go from the verb to the pronoun. So training yourself to predict the pronoun when you see fa'alta, training yourself to know that this belongs to anta. Fa'altunna belongs to antunna, etc. Finally, we have strategy number 3, the conjugation marathon. In other words, practice. So there actually is no shortcut to mastering conjugation. If you want to master it, you need to practice. You need to drill the conjugation rules and patterns into your mind by doing lots and lots of conjugation. There's no shortcut around it, trust me. So I would urge you to go to this site over here and to open up this PDF document, which contains the most common verbs that appear in the Quran. And I want you to take 5 verbs a day, just 5 verbs, and just focus on the far right column because we haven't learned the other forms yet. Take these verbs and conjugate 5 a day for each person. Draw out the entire chart, just like this over here. Do this for each of the 5 verbs. And I guarantee you, within a week, you will know conjugation like the back of your hand, inshallah. Now, on to topic number 2, the main topic for today's lesson. How to conjugate verbs in the present tense. Al-fi'l al-mudari'. So, to introduce al-fi'l al-mudari', there are 3 types. 3 types of cases or case endings for al-fi'l al-mudari'. And they are the marfu', mansub, and majzoom cases. Marfu', mansub, and majzoom. The marfu' case is the default case. This is basically the case that we use when there's nothing else special going on. So there are no other special circumstances or factors in the sentence. That means we would use al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu'. As for the other 2, they are used only when special factors are present. Special factors that require us to use the mansub case are called nawasib, singular nasib. And special factors that require us to use the majzoom case are called jawazim, singular jazim. And we'll be talking about the mansub and the majzoom and their respective nawasib and jawazim in the next lesson, inshallah. For this lesson, we'll be focusing on the marfu' case, the default case. So here we have it again. We have al-fi'l al-mudari', the present tense, broken down into its 3 major classes or types of cases. We have the marfu', the mansub, and the majzoom. So one more concept I want to introduce before we dive into the conjugation rules for the marfu' case, and that is the concept of markers, the marker. Each type of case in Arabic is characterized by unique markers. So notice how for the verb yaktub, we have a sukun on the end. The sukun is the unique marker for the majzoom case. So one way to think about it is because the verb is majzoom, it takes a sukun. Another second way to look at it is the sukun on the end of the verb tells us that it is in the majzoom case. Both ways of looking at it are valid. Next, we have yaktuba with a fatha. The fatha in this case would be the marker for the mansub. And finally, we have yaktubu with a dhamma on the end. The dhamma would be the unique marker for the marfu'. The Arabic word for marker is alama, and we'll be talking about the different alamas for all of these different cases in much more detail in future lessons, inshallah. Just want to point you to the fact that these markers exist, and I want you to pay attention to the variability. What does al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu' really mean? So let me provide some examples to illustrate. Number one, we have adrusu tib. Adrusu tib. The verb here is adrus, which can be translated as I study medicine. So the sentence would mean exactly what it does in English. I'm a med student right now. I'm studying medicine. Example number two, يشعر محمد بالحزن. يشعر محمد بالحزن, which can be translated as Muhammad feels sad. But what is understood from this sentence is the fact that he is feeling sad right now in this present moment. So the verb يشعر means he is feeling sad right now in the present. Last but not least, we have يصلي محمد في الصباح. يصلي محمد في الصباح. Translation, Muhammad prays in the morning. Muhammad prays in the morning. Now, the understanding here is that Muhammad prays every morning, not just this morning, but also yesterday and the day before, into the past. So another translation would be Muhammad would pray every morning. This action of praying is continuous and habitual. So we have several acceptable meanings for al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu'. Number one, the action is happening in the present. يشعر محمد بالحزن. Number two, the fact that the action is ongoing, continuous or habitual. يصلي محمد في الصباح. He prays every morning as a habit. And number three, which I did not provide an example for, an action that will happen in the future, and usually in the near future. This is also an acceptable meaning of al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu'. So all three are possible meanings. Just like we did when we learned the past tense conjugation rules, we'll be using the form 1 verb to learn the present tense conjugation rules, because form 1 is very easy to work with. Now, do keep in mind that these rules are patterns. They're general patterns that apply for all verbs, not just form 1. But if you know how form 1 works, the other 9 forms will be fairly simple and straightforward. Just like with the past tense, we'll be using the basic verb fa'ala as the stencil, as the basic pattern on which we will apply our conjugation rules. So the verb yaf'alu, huwa yaf'alu, is in the present fi'l mudari' marfu' tense. This means he does. And just like with the past tense verb, we can have a different middle vowel. So we can have yaf'alu with a fatha, or yaf'ulu with a dhamma, or yaf'ilu with a kasra. Yaf'alu, yaf'ulu, or yaf'ilu. And this variability cannot be predicted. So whether the middle vowel is a kasra, a dhamma, or a fatha depends on the verb itself. It's inherent to the verb and must be memorized. Beginning with the singular pronouns, we have on the top huwa, and the 3 different middle vowel variations, yaf'alu, yaf'ulu, or yaf'ilu. Hiya, which means she, is conjugated as taf'alu, or taf'ulu, or taf'ilu. Notice how we changed, we've swapped out the ya for a ta, taf'alu. Anta, which means you masculine, is taf'alu, just like it is with hiya. Exact same. Taf'alu, or taf'ulu, or taf'ilu. And then we have anti, which means you, singular, feminine, a little more complicated. Taf'alina, taf'alina, or taf'ulina, taf'ulina, or taf'ilina, taf'ilina. Notice how we have the ta, but then we've added an ina, which gives us a very long conjugation for anti. Finally, we have ana, which means I. Ana af'alu, ana af'ulu, or ana af'ilu, for all 3 different middle vowels. Now, I want you to memorize just this column right here, just this column. So you can ignore the other 2 because, again, these are just variations on the middle vowel, which can be adjusted for. Just memorize this column right here. And notice I've highlighted the modifications in red. So we have yaf'alu for huwa. There's a ya in the front. Hiya, anta, and anti all have a ta in the front. And the ana has a hamza. Ana af'alu. And notice how we have the lam with a dhamma for huwa, hiya, anta, and ana. Yaf'alu, taf'alu, taf'alu, af'alu. And then for anti, we have a longer form, taf'alina. So please repeat and memorize this. Huwa yaf'alu, hiya taf'alu, anta taf'alu, anti taf'alina, ana af'alu. Just like that. Repeat and memorize. Let us now take a look at some examples. So I've provided a representative verb to be an example for each of the different types of middle vowels that you encounter, the fatha, the dhamma, and the kasra. So for the first verb, huwa yadhhabu. Huwa yadhhabu. Dhahaba yadhhab means to go. So huwa yadhhabu means he goes. Notice the fatha on top of the ha. Verb number 2, huwa yaktubu. Huwa yaktubu, which means he writes. He writes. Notice the dhamma as the middle vowel. And then finally, the last verb is huwa yaqsidu. Huwa yaqsidu. Notice the kasra underneath the sad. So as we run through the conjugations for each of the singular pronouns, I want you to pay attention to the fact that this middle vowel, the ha with the fatha, ta with the dhamma, and the sad with the kasra, this middle vowel is preserved all the way down. It's not going to change because it's an essential, inherent characteristic of the verb itself. So let's start. Hiya tadhhabu, anta tadhhabu, anti tadhhabina, ana adhhabu. For the verb kataba yaktubu, hiya taktubu, anta taktubu, anti taktubina, ana aktubu. And then for the final verb, huwa yaqsidu, hiya taqsidu, anta taqsidu, anti taqsidina, ana aqsidu. Moving on to the rules for the plural pronouns, we have on the very top hum, which means they, masculine, hunna, they, feminine, antum, you all, masculine, antunna, you all, feminine, and nahnu, which means we. So again, each of these three columns represent the three different middle vowels that you can get on top of the middle root letter. Huwa yaf'alu, hum yaf'aluna, hum yaf'aluna. Notice how we've added una to the end. Yaf'aluna. Huwa yaf'ulu, hum yaf'uluna. Huwa yaf'ilu, hum yaf'iluna. Hunna, we have hunna yaf'alna, hunna yaf'ulna, and hunna yaf'ilna. Yaf'ilna. We've shortened, we've added a sukun onto the lam, and we've added a noon with fatha afterwards. Antum taf'aluna, antum taf'aluna, antum taf'uluna, antum taf'uluna, and antum taf'iluna. Antum taf'iluna. We've changed the ya into a ta, so that's how you convert from the hum to the antum. We're switching the ya out for a ta. Taf'aluna. Next we have antunna, antunna taf'alna, antunna taf'ulna, and antunna taf'ilna. Notice how this is very similar to hunna, so the feminine plural forms are very similar, yaf'alna and taf'alna. We're switching out the ya for the ta. And lastly, for nahnu, which means we, nahnu naf'alu, nahnu naf'ulu, and nahnu naf'ilu. Now I want you to pay attention to the modifications we've made. Hum yaf'aluna, we've added the una to the back, just like we did for antum. So they and you all are very similar. The only difference is the ya and the ta in the front. Hunna and antunna are very similar, except for the ya and the ta in the front. And nahnu, naf'al. The noon corresponds to the noon in nahnu. Please repeat and memorize these verbs. هم يفعلون, هن يفعلن, أنتم تفعلون, أنتن تفعلن, نحن نفعل. Just like you would do for the singular pronouns. On to some examples. We'll be using the same verbs. يذهب, يكتب, and يقصد. So for whom, remember we've added una to the end. هو يذهب, هم يذهبون, هم يذهبون. هن يذهبن, أنتم تذهبون, أنتن تذهبن, نحن نذهب. Again, notice the middle vowel, fatha, is the same on top of the ha, all the way through. Verb yaktubu, we have hum yaktubuna, hunna yaktubna, antum taktubuna, antunna taktubna, nahnu naktubu. And then the final verb, yaqsid, hum yaqsiduna, hunna yaqsidna, antum taqsiduna, أنتن تقصدن, نحن نقصد. So here are the rules that we just learned, summarized in a simplified chart form. I would highly recommend that you write this chart out on a piece of paper. Write it out several times. If you need the personal standalone pronouns, huwa, hiya, anta, anti, write them out. It's not a problem. If you don't, just write the verbs, but write them in the correct positions, like I described earlier under the visualizing the chart strategy. So let me just repeat this very quickly for you. Huwa yaf'alu, hum yaf'aluna, hiya taf'alu, hunna yaf'alna, anta taf'alu, antum taf'aluna, anti taf'alina, antunna taf'alna, ana af'alu, nahnu naf'alu. And again, this verb means to do. So huwa yaf'al means he does. Antum taf'aluna, you all do. نحن نفعل, we do. Now, in order to become better, you have to practice. Like I mentioned before, there is no shortcut around it. You have to practice. That is the silver bullet solution. Just to take verbs and conjugate them. Fill out the entire chart. But what can make the process a little easier and probably more enjoyable is noticing and appreciating certain patterns that hold true for these verbs. So in the next few slides, I'll be showing some of these general patterns and trends. Observation number 1, note that all present tense verbs, al-fi'l mudari' marfu', or actually all fi'l mudari' for all three cases, all of them begin with hamza, noon, ta, or ya. So notice how we have the ya for most of the third person pronouns except for the hiya. We have a ta in front of every single verb conjugated in the second person. And then we have noon for nahnu, naf'al, and hamza for ana af'al. So all present tense verbs will begin with one of these letters, hamza, noon, ta, or ya. Now, it's not necessarily true that every verb that begins with one of these letters must be in the present tense. That is not true. You have verbs like akhadha, which means he took, that is in the past tense. That begins with a hamza. But do note that all present tense verbs will begin with one of these letters. Observation number 2. These so-called prefixes match their pronouns, so they're very easy to learn. Basically, ana af'al, there's a hamza in front of both. A and a, ana af'alu, and nahnu naf'alu, nahnu naf'alu. So there's a direct correspondence that should help you learn these conjugations. Observation number 3. Okay, I want you to pay attention over here. The masculine second and third person conjugations are very similar. The masculine second and third person. So on the top, we have the third person and second person, masculine. So we're talking about these over here. They are very similar. So to go from huwa to whom, remember all we did was we added una. Huwa yaf'alu, hum yaf'aluna. يفعل يفعلون. Same thing for the second person. أنت تفعل أنتم تفعلون أنتم تفعلون. To go from singular to plural, again, just add una. تفعل تفعلون. Observation number 4, a final note. The feminine plural verbs are similar. So by these, I'm referring to hunna, hunna yaf'alna, and antunna, antunna taf'alna. The only difference between them is the ya and the ta. Ya for third person, ta for second person. Technically, these two verbs are fixed. So what I mean is, remember how I talked about al-fi' mudari', which can be broken down into three classes. We can have marfu' or mansub or majzoom. So yaf'alu is the marfu' case. If we make it into mansub, we have to change it to yaf'ala with a fatha, or majzoom would give it a sukun, yaf'al. But these two verbs, yaf'alna and taf'alna, are the same. They are fixed, regardless of the circumstances. So we call them fi' mudari' without the need for specifying marfu' or mansub or majzoom. They are simply called fi' mudari'. For every other verb in the present tense, we have to specify, we have to designate what type of mudari' it is. We have to say al-fi' mudari' al-mansub or al-marfu' or al-majzoom. But these two, yaf'alna and taf'alna, are exceptions to the rule. And we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in the future, inshallah. The Form 1 verb can have a different middle vowel in its maldi, past tense, and in its mudari', present tense. What do I mean? Let's look at some examples. Dakhala, which means he entered in the maldi. What's the middle vowel here? We have a fatha on top of the kha. But in the present tense, in the mudari', it becomes yadkhulu. The fatha has changed into a dhamma. Example number 2, jalasa, which means he sat, has a fatha on top of the middle root letter, but that changes into a kasra when we go to mudari'. Yajlisu, jalasa yajlisu. Rakiba has a kasra that changes into a fatha, yarkabu. Dafa'a yadfa'u. So in this case, the fatha is conserved. It's the same both in the past tense and in the present tense. Takeaway message is the fact that the middle vowel cannot be predicted. So just because you know that dakhala has a fatha as the middle vowel in the maldi, that tells us nothing about what the middle vowel could be in the present tense. Dakhala yadkhul. It could also be the same, dafa'a yadfa'. There's no way for us to know. And this is why, unlike the other forms, Form 1 is trickier. There is no way for us to predict the middle vowel. You must, again I repeat, you must memorize the past and the present tense together as a set. Dakhala yadkhul, just like that. Dakhala yadkhul. You repeat it together. Jalasa yajlis, rakiba yarkab, dafa'a yadfa'. The past and present tense conjugation rules that we learned apply to all verbs. So these are general trends and patterns that apply to all verbs in Arabic. This will become especially apparent when we cover the other verb forms in the near future. So even though I taught you these rules using the Form 1 verb, using fa'ala yaf'alu, remember, and this is the point I have been stressing over and over again, these rules apply to all verbs. Once you've memorized them, you've essentially unlocked conjugation for an infinite number of Arabic verbs that you will ever encounter in your life. Each verb is unique because each verb is unique, but its conjugation or filling its chart is stereotypical because it follows the same rules. All you need is the huwa verb, the huwa form. And then from there you can form all of the other conjugations as needed. So for the past tense, that would be fa'ala. From there you can derive all the other conjugations for the other pronouns using very basic modifications that we've learned previously. And then for the mudari' marfu', yaf'alu can give you all the other conjugations with slight modifications. So that is all you need. All you need is fa'ala yaf'alu. That is why we memorize fa'ala yaf'alu. And we don't memorize anything else because those can be formed or derived on the spot. Now, before we move on to examples from the Quran of al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu', let me do some comprehensive review with you. So we're going to be doing present tense marfu' conjugation for two verbs that I've selected, just as practice. So the verb here is sami'a, sami'a, which means to hear. Sami'a actually means he heard. In the present tense, that would be yasma'u. Notice how the middle vowel is different. We have a kasra in the past tense, which becomes a fatha in the present tense. Yasma'u. Yasma'u means he hears. He hears. Yasma'una. Hum yasma'una. They hear. Again, we've added una to the end. That tells you it's plural. Hiya, she hears. Hiya tasma'u. They, female, all feminine, hear. Yasma'na. Yasma'na. You hear. Tasma'u. You all hear. Tasma'una. Have the una ending for the plural designation. Tasma'una. You hear for a singular feminine. Tasma'ina. And you all. Tasma'na. Ana asma'u. Nahnu nasma'u. We hear. Example number 2. Kataba, which means he wrote. In the present tense, it becomes yaktubu. Again, note the change in the middle vowel from fatha to a dhamma. This must be memorized. Yaktubu, which means he writes. They write. We add the una. Yaktubuna. Taktubu, she writes. Yaktubna, they, feminine, write. Taktubu, you write. Taktubuna, you all, masculine, write. Taktubina, you, singular feminine, write. Taktubna, you all write. Feminine. Ana aktubu, I write. Nahnu naktubu, we write. That concludes our comprehensive review of al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu' conjugation. My final plea to you is, again, please practice. Practice, practice, practice. Take a verb, any verb, and conjugate it. And then write them out using this simplified chart format. You don't need the English. Just write out the conjugations and repeat them out loud to yourself as you're writing them. Yaktubu, yaktubuna, taktubu, yaktubna, etc. And also choose verbs with different middle vowels. Okay, so choose ones with dhamma, choose ones with fatha and kasra as well. You want to be comprehensive. And inshallah, if you practice, you will get better. And it's guaranteed, inshallah. Topic number 3, how to negate al-fi'l al-mudari' al-marfu'. To review, we negate al-fi'l al-madi, the past tense verb, by adding ma in the front. So, dhahaba, he went. Ma dhahaba, he didn't go. Now, in order to negate al-fi'l mudari' marfu', we add la in the front. La. La in Arabic generally means no, but here grammatically, its usage is to negate al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu'. Examples. يذهب إلى المسجد. يذهب إلى المسجد. He goes to the masjid. To negate the sentence, we add la. لا يذهب إلى المسجد. He doesn't go to the masjid. نفهم الدرس. نفهم الدرس. We understand the lesson. To negate that, لا نفهم الدرس. لا نفهم الدرس. We don't understand the lesson. There are different types of la in Arabic. This is called la النافية. La النافية. La for negation, or la للنفي. There's also la for prohibition. La الناهية. La الناهية, which is for prohibiting, for telling someone not to do something. La تذهب. Don't go to the masjid. And that's a different type of la. And that has its own set of rules, which we will learn in the future too. So remember, to negate al-fi'l mudari', we just add a la in the front of the verb. It's very, very straightforward. Now let's take a look at some examples of al-fi'l mudari' marfu' taken from the Quran al-Kareem. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Ayah number 1 from Surah Al-Fatiha. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. you alone we worship, and you alone we turn to seeking for help. So the verbs here are na'budu, which is conjugated for nahnu, and nasta'in, conjugated also for nahnu. So nasta'in should actually be nasta'inu with a dhamma on the end if you pronounce the entire verb. But since we're stopping, we stop with the sukun in recitation. Notice how both verbs have a noon at the front for nahnu, and also both verbs end in dhamma. So that tells us something about this noon here. It's not the same noon that we have in taf'aluna or yaf'aluna. This noon has a dhamma on top, not a fatha. So it is actually part of the root letters of the word itself. So this is a form 10 verb, and we'll talk about this in more detail in future lessons. Ayah number 2. لا أعبد ما تعبدون. I do not worship what you worship. So this is an example of a negation. This is لا النافية, لا النافية, negating this verb. لا أعبد, I do not worship. So أعبد conjugated for أنا. Notice the hamza in the front and the dhamma on the end. تعبدون, تعبدون, conjugated for أنتم. تفعلون, or تفعلون, تفعلون with the dhamma as a middle vowel, conjugated for أنتم, what you all worship. Ayah number 3. وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. And you see people entering into Allah's religion in crowds or multitudes. وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. So the fi'l mudari' marfu' in this ayah is يَدْخُلُونَ يَفْعُلُونَ. Notice the ya in the front and the noon with a fatha in the end. This is conjugated for whom. They enter. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. Say, I seek refuge with the Lord of daybreak. So the verb here is أعوذ, conjugated for أنا. Notice the hamza in the front, dhamma on the end. A very similar verse from Surah An-Nas. قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ. Again we have أعوذ, say I seek refuge with the Lord of people. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. Here we have يَسْأَلُونَكَ يَفْعَلُونَ, يَفْعَلُونَ. You can ignore the kaf for now, that's an attached personal pronoun. But the verb is يَسْأَلُونَ, يَسْأَلُونَ, and they ask you regarding the soul. And they ask you about the soul. So the verb is يَسْأَلُونَ, they ask, conjugated for whom. Next example. قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَدْعُو رَبِّي وَلَا أُشْرِكُ بِهِ أَحَدًا. Say, indeed, I only invoke my Lord, and I do not associate anyone with him. The verb here is أَدْعُو, أَدْعُو, conjugated for أَنَا. وَلَا أُشْرِكُ. This is an example of a negation. We have لا أشرك, I do not associate. Ushrik is conjugated for أنا. Next example, an ayah taken from Surah Al-Ahzab. وَإِن كُنتُنَّ تُرِدْنَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَالدَّارَ الْآخِرَةَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وَإِن كُنتُنَّ. But if you desire Allah and His Messenger and the abode of the hereafter. So because the address is to the wives of the Prophet, which is a group of women, we have conjugation for antunna, turidna antunna. Now this verb is slightly trickier because number one, it's an example of a form 4 verb, arada yuridu. And number two, this verb is what we call ajwaf or hollow. So if you couldn't exactly tell that we've conjugated for antunna, don't worry. If you could, good for you. Also note that verbs conjugated for hunna and antunna, the two feminine plural conjugations, are relatively rare in the Quran. Relatively less common, I should say, compared to the other verbs. Next example. وَقِيلِهِ يَا رَبِّ إِنَّ هَؤُلَاءِ قَوْمٌ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ. And his saying, وَقِيلِهِ يَا رَبِّ, O my Lord, إِنَّ هَؤُلَاءِ, indeed these are a people who do not believe. So here we have an example of a negation, لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ, who do not believe. The conjugation is for whom يُؤْمِنُونَ. وهو الذي يقبل التوبة عن عباده ويعفو عن السيئات ويعلم ما تفعلون. Here we have quite a few verbs. يقبل, يفعل, conjugated for هو. يعفو, conjugated for هو. And يعلم, يفعل, conjugated for هو. Of course, all three verbs are talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَهُوَ الَّذِي يَقْبَلُ التَّوْبَةَ, and it is He who accepts repentance from His servants. وَيَعْفُو عَنِ السَّيِّئَاتِ, and forgives sins. وَيَعْلَمُ مَا تَفْعَلُونَ, and He knows what you do. So تَفْعَلُونَ, the fourth verb, what you do, conjugated for antum. Notice how for يَعْفُو, the ending is a little bit different. Okay, so we have a waw, and then it doesn't look quite the same like the other verbs, and that's because this verb is what we call naqis, or incomplete. This is an example of one type of irregularity, and we'll discuss this in more detail in the future. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَسْمَعُونَ. The verb here is يَسْمَعُونَ, following the pattern يَفْعَلُونَ. So the conjugation is for whom, they hear. Indeed, in this, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَسْمَعُونَ. Indeed, in this are signs for a people who hear. And a very similar verse, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَعْقِلُونَ. The verb is يَعْقِلُونَ, following the pattern يَفْعِلُونَ. And this is, of course, conjugated for whom. Indeed, in this are signs for a people who exercise their intellect, for a people who use reason to think. Of course, pay attention to the beginnings and ends of the verbs. So notice how we have the ya here, ya, ta for tafa'aluna, ya and a ta. And also pay attention to the endings of the verbs as well. وَيَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَنفَعُهُمْ وَلَا يَضُرُّهُمْ. And they worship besides Allah that which can neither benefit them nor harm them. So the first verb is يَعْبُدُونَ, they worship, following the pattern يَفْعُلُونَ. So this is conjugation for whom, they worship. Besides Allah, what cannot benefit them. لا ينفعهم, this is an example of a negation. ينفع, يفعل, this is conjugation for huwa. And then a very similar construction. ولا يضرهم, negation here. لا يضر, what cannot harm them. So these are conjugations for huwa. Now, why is that the case? What is the huwa here? The huwa is actually referring back to the ma, that. So whatever it is here that they are worshipping. وَيَعْبُدُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَنفَعُهُمْ وَلَا يَضُرُّهُمْ. The conjugation is for the ma. That's why we have huwa in both cases. يَوْمَ تَشْهَدُ عَلَيْهِمْ أَلْسِنَتُهُمْ وَأَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُمْ بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. We have تَشْهَدُ, يَوْمَ تَشْهَدُ, on the day when their tongues, hands, and feet will testify. Tashhadu means to testify. Testify against them about what they used to do. يَوْمَ تَشْهَدُ. So this is an example of a verb conjugated for hiya. Hiya. Hiya tashhadu, hiya taf'alu. Why is that the case? That's because tongues, hands, and feet, these are considered non-human plurals. So non-human plurals in Arabic are treated like feminine in terms of conjugation. They are given the feminine conjugation, feminine singular. So they're conjugated for hiya. ألسنتهم وأيديهم وأرجلهم تشهد عليهم. And then, of course, we have, I forgot to circle over here, but we have يعملون conjugated for whom, يفعلون, what they used to do. يعملون, to do. Next verse, وما تدري نفس ماذا تكسب غدا وما تدري نفس بأي أرض تموت. We have تكسب over here. So the translation of this verse is, no soul knows what it will reap tomorrow. So no soul knows what it will reap tomorrow, and no soul knows in what land it will die. The verb taksib, taksibu, is conjugated for hiya taksibu. That is referring to the nafs, the soul, which is singular feminine in Arabic. Also we have tamut, tamutu, also conjugated as hiya, referring to the soul, in which the soul dies or what the soul acquires. Taksib wa tamut. ولا يحل لهن أن يكتمن ما خلق الله في أرحامهن. Taken from Surah Al-Baqarah, we have, and it is unlawful, ولا يحل, for them to conceal what Allah has created in their wombs. So here we have an example, yaktumna, yaf'ulna, yaktumna, yaf'ulna. This is a conjugation for hunna, referring to a group of females. For them, the females, to conceal. ما خلق الله في أرحامهن, what Allah has created in their wombs. From Surah Al-Mumtahina, يا أيها النبي إذا جاءك المؤمنات يبايعنك على ألا يشركن بالله شيئا ولا يسرقن ولا يزنين. So here we have يبايعنك. The kaf is an attached pronoun, so the verb is يبايعن. We have لا يشركن. We have ولا يسرقن. And then ولا يزنين as well. So all four verbs are conjugated for hunna, for a group of females, al-mu'minat, right, the believing women. You have yubayirna, yushrikna, yasriqna, and yaznina. They all begin with ya, and they all end with that fixed noon. So remember how we discussed the feminine plural verbs, the feminine plural conjugations for the present tense, and how they are not classified as marfu', mansub, or majzoom. We simply call them fi' mudari'. So that's the case over here with all four verbs, because they're conjugated for hunna. Last example, تعلم ما في نفسي ولا أعلم ما في نفسك. This is taken from Surah Al-Ma'idah, in which the Prophet Isa alayhi salam is speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. تعلم ما في نفسي, and you know what is in myself, ولا أعلم ما في نفسك, and I do not know what is in you, what is in yourself. So تعلم, you know, this is taf'alu, on the taf'alu pattern, conjugated for anta, because Isa is addressing Allah. وَلَا أَعْلَمُ, an example of a negation, and I do not know. So أعلم, أفعل, conjugated for ana. This brings us to the end of lesson number 4. Here is a quick review of what we learned in this lesson. Number 1, we learned that there are some strategies that we can use to become better at conjugation. These include visualizing the chart. So training yourself to picture the condensed, simplified version of the verb conjugation chart without the personal pronouns. Number 2, going from pronoun to verb or verb to pronoun, so predicting one based on the other. And finally, number 3, just plain old practice. We also learned that the present tense is called al-fi' al-mudari', and this can be broken down into 3 types of case endings: the marfu', the mansub, and the majzoom, based on the presence of various factors, various special factors. And nawasib for the mansub, al-jawazim for the majzoom. We learned the conjugation rules for al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu'. They are as follows. Also note that the marfu' case endings can either be a dhamma on the last root letter, as is the case for huwa, hiya, anta, ana, and nahnu, or it can be a noon with a fatha, such as in hum and antum and anti, or it can be a noon with a fatha that is fixed for the feminine plural pronouns hunna and antunna. And these forms are fixed and the same for all three types of case endings under al-fi'l mudari'. Finally, we learned how to negate al-fi'l mudari' al-marfu'. We do this by adding a la in the front, and this is called la an-nafiya. Thank you for watching lesson number 4.